Let's begin with prayer. O Lord Jesus Christ, you are the same yesterday, today, and forever. We thank you for the Christians who have been your witnesses in this city for more than 2 centuries now, and we ask that we might be faithful to their example in our own time. To you be the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
So I'll just share my screen if I can. And that visible?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, as we saw last week, those final years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century saw an awful lot of activity and cooperation among Christians of all denominations on behalf of the poor and immigrants and the disenfranchised in their struggle for social justice. And that was how it was starting to be seen by the end of the 19th century, not just a matter of charity, but as a matter of social justice. So beside the initiatives and the agencies that we talked about last week, there were all sorts of other organizations that just there isn't time to talk about in terms of what was established here in Toronto to support the poor, immigrants, elderly, children, women, refugees, and many of them, the names you may recognize, still survive down to this day, such as the Widows and Orphans Fund has moved on, but certainly the Catholic Children's Aid Society is still going on, the Fred Victor Mission is still going on, the St. Elizabeth Visiting Nurses is still going on. Some of them were quite interestingly initiated by lay people, not just by the ministers of the various churches. Such, for example, was the Humewood House for Unwed Mothers. I don't know if any of you recognize that, but that was actually established by some women who were parishioners from St. Thomas's on Huron Street. And as you can see, a lot of the other ones that were there, all attempting to make a change for people in the city. One of the ones that had the greatest effect, of course, was the Methodist Mothers Pension Committee. And they had been the ones that had been fighting for years to get family allowances established in the province of Ontario. And eventually they did succeed. So anyway, that's just to remind ourselves that besides the ones that I did mention last week, there were all sorts of other church groups that really were doing a huge amount of work to be able to make sure that the disenfranchised, the poor, had justice in the city. And this is all, of course, happening in an era before the government becomes seriously involved in these activities. As the First World War approaches, it was clear that all of the churches were arriving at the very same conclusion, that these things should not just be seen as works of charity anymore, extended by the haves to the have-nots, but as works of justice to change society in keeping with the teachings of Christ himself. Now, as that long 19th century was approaching its end, about the year 1914, Christians have become more realistic about the causes and effects of the economic and social challenges that were facing Toronto society. But there was this optimism at the time before the war that with the various Christian churches working together, communities could actually be healed and strengthened. And part of that optimism was fueled by what had come to be known as liberal Protestantism, a movement that had begun in Europe, really, in the middle of the 19th century, mostly in Northern Europe, in Germany and that area. Its optimistic principles were embraced in Toronto by many Anglicans and Presbyterians and Methodists and other religious groups, especially those communities that had already embraced what I referred to last week as the social gospel. Liberal Protestantism never denied the central role of Christ in salvation, but it did tend to place its emphasis slightly differently on what they called the brotherhood of man. And they believed that it was possible to advance, to progress in society, not entirely totally dependent on God's grace, which had been kind of part of Protestant DNA for 400 years, but also by the works of human beings working together, Christians working together. All of this optimism about the steady progress of humanity through an appeal to our better natures was going to be shattered, sadly, by the First World War, not only in Toronto, but around the Christian world. Now, Toronto itself entered into the First World War with a veneer of religious unity, but there were divisions that were already lurking not far beneath the surface. Now, you have to understand that census records indicate that Toronto's population by 1914 was still about 85% British, meaning that the population of the city was tied by birth and affection to the British Isles. Support for the war was very quickly expressed from all of the pulpits of Toronto's many churches, both Catholic and Protestant. Now, it shouldn't surprise us, I suppose, that the largest number of volunteers came from the city's Anglican churches. About 46.8% of the volunteers came from the Anglican Church. But 15% of the population in Toronto by this point were recent immigrants to the city from places like Italy, Syria, surprisingly, and Eastern Europe, including a very large and growing number of Jews. And the presence of these people in Toronto quickly became a hot button issue. Just as an example, but a really good example, by 1914, there were about 3,000 Greeks who were living in the city of Toronto, and not a huge number, admittedly. But they enjoyed a disproportionately high profile in Toronto because they operated about 35% of the restaurants and the coffee shops that were in the city. Now, their own homeland of Greece had declared itself neutral at the beginning of the war. And so many, many young and unnaturalized Greek men were working in Toronto, and they were not allowed to volunteer for the Canadian Army. That was because they were not yet, as I say, naturalized citizens, and their home country had declared itself neutral. Well, this became a flashpoint for Toronto's established families, and these young Greek men were regularly accused of being slackers, and they were harassed on the streets of the city. They're probably the best example from the period of the sense of the other who is in our midst, in a city that, quite frankly, had always had problems with each new immigration wave. Now, the Greeks were particularly caught in the crosshairs for two reasons. First of all, oddly enough, they were not considered to be Caucasians in 1914 coming from Greece. And second of all, they were the very first Christians in the city whose theology and religious expression came from the long separated and rather mysterious Eastern Church. This is very unfamiliar to the people in the city of Toronto. So what happened? Well, sadly, on the August long weekend of 1918, resentment finally bubbled over and led to the largest anti-Greek riots that have ever been recorded anywhere in the city of Toronto. Contemporary reports state that 50,000 Torontonians participated in the riots, and by the end, most of the city's Greek restaurants, coffee houses, and shops were destroyed within a 24-hour period, the police reluctant to step in, and these were fellow Christians. In 2016, the city commemorated these riots with the historical plaque that you're looking at here, erected near the place where the riots had actually begun. Now, the Greeks were not alone in terms of this kind of problem. Catholics also experienced similar challenges at the time in the city, despite the fact that they had worked very hard at integrating into Toronto society, and statistics show that their men had volunteered for service at the very same rate as their Protestant fellow citizens. In fact, at the very beginning of World War I, the Roman Catholic Archbishop Neil McNeill addressed a recruitment rally in the city saying that, quote, "In the conflict which we are facing, and let us realize that we are facing stern conditions, in that conflict, there is no difference between Protestants and Catholics." That support notwithstanding, Catholics remained under a cloud of suspicion in Toronto, since at the very same time that McNeill was offering his full support for the war effort, Pope Benedict XV had declared that the Vatican would be neutral in the conflict because Catholics were fighting on both sides of the war. Nevertheless, the Toronto Catholic Church, which was still largely Irish in composition, was very enthusiastic in its support for the war, and it even endorsed conscription when that whole subject finally raised its ugly head. Part of the reason was because those Catholic men eligible for active service, these Irish Canadians, were now 2 and 3 generations removed from their immigrant ancestors, and both priests and people now saw themselves very much as Canadians first, and therefore as citizens of the larger British Empire. And so they did volunteer in very large numbers. Despite their attempts to demonstrate their loyalty, Toronto Catholics were frequently targeted for criticism in local newspapers. And the reason for that was because the Toronto papers refused to distinguish between the stand that Toronto Catholics had taken supporting the war effort and the anti-war stand that had been taken up by the majority of Catholics in the province of Quebec. No distinction was really made between the two. Well, the war began, it continued, and it ended with absolute support from the pulpits of the city of Toronto. The Reverend Thomas Eakins of St. Andrew's Presbyterian on King Street, he used his sermons as recruitment tools. And he's a really important figure in all this because most of the sermons from the period of the First World War in Toronto don't exist. Thomas Eakins do, for reasons that are a matter of the archivist for St. Andrew's Presbyterian. But there are very few sermons that survive from the other denominations. But Eakins here, preaching on the Beatitudes in the very first weeks after the conflict began, he described the Canadian soldiers as peacemakers of today. And he adapted Christ's words to say, "Blessed are ye armed, booted, and equipped for slaughter. We say it because we must. Blessed are ye peacemakers." It's a very different message from what we would expect. He continued in this very same tone throughout the entirety of the First World War, especially as the conscription crisis loomed. And in May of 1917, in one sermon, he said, "This war, which is convulsing the world today, is a war against Antichrist. It is savage, bestial, loathsome, foul, unrestrained, in which there is no attempt to be governed by the principles of morality, much less Christianity." Beyond words, however, there was also action. Archdeacon Henry Cody of St. Paul's Bloor Street, for example, he organized a drive to get food to the Belgians after the invasion of that country. And the people of St. Paul's, that one parish alone, sent 2,382 bags of flour to assist the poor Belgians. Other Anglican congregations raised money to buy guns when it was reported that our soldiers didn't have sufficient weapons, while the Anglican church women knitted socks and scarves and rolled bandage till their fingers hurt. Meanwhile, Catholic women were also keeping their hands busy knitting, collecting clothing, and making socks on behalf of the soldiers. Rosary Hall, which was the city's hostel for Catholic working women, reported that its residents had donated 2,800 pairs of socks, 280 hospital shirts, and 35,072 units of surgical supplies. So everybody across the denominations were involved, especially among the women. Catholic women also volunteered as nurses through the agency of St. Michael's Hospital, which in April of 1915 sent these women its first contingent of nurses to Europe. So the activities of all of these women to the war effort, no matter what their religious tradition, contributed to a very important cultural shift that was already happening in the country with regards to the role of women in society. Now, we should bear in mind, women had been granted the right to vote in federal elections on the 24th of May, 1918, not long before the war ended. The churches, however, in Toronto were often a little behind in recognizing the role women had played during the war and their ongoing contributions to parish life. As you can see here, I hope you can see where I've got my cursor going, where it says Mr. Baird. You can see here St. Martin's annual vestry meeting, for example, which was held on the 19th of November, 1919. It was only then that women were finally voted upon and granted the right to vote at vestry in St. Martin's. So it's more than a year after they were granted the right to vote nationally. But I think this gives us a sense of what was happening, because what we are seeing is that Christianity, which had for so long, 200 years, almost 200, well, 150 years, had been shaping the city's culture, was now beginning to be shaped by the culture itself. The aftermath of the war presented serious difficulties for Christians who were trying to live out their faith in Toronto. Returning soldiers themselves were described by their own chaplains as indifferent to religion. They had been forced to take part in church parades while they were taking part in the hostilities over in Europe. And during the Bloody War, this led them to ridicule the participation in these particular events. And it caused many of them in the end to give up completely on organized religion when they returned to Toronto. One Baptist chaplain who had served overseas, he made a point of interviewing the returning Toronto veterans, and he discovered that few of the soldiers expressed any belief in any particular creed anymore, and they did not express their religious beliefs in biblical language. Moreover, many now claimed to hold no religion. So the First World War was going to have a huge impact on the religious culture of Toronto. This was entirely new territory for a society which up to this point had been so steeped in the visible religiosity of the years leading up to 1914. We also know that a significant number of the men who left seminaries to go and fight in the war did not return after the peace. A majority of the students, for example, from the Presbyterian Theological College in Kingston, they dropped out of the seminary after the war. And similarly, a significant percentage of Methodist chaplains completely cut their ties to the church once the hostilities were over. So this is going to mean that there's going to be a clergy shortage in the city in those immediate years after 1918. Some veterans, however, did resonate with this image of Christ as sacrifice. But scholars of the period have concluded that this association didn't necessarily translate into reverence for organized religion anymore or belief in a providential God, given everything they experienced. And yet, that imagery itself becomes very important as part of the memorials that get to be erected in Toronto churches in the aftermath. Here, of course, you recognize this window. The window commemorating the First World War victims for St. Martin's was installed to remember the dead, 16 dead who were killed in battle. And of course, what is the image that is used? It is the crucifixion scene. Similar stained glass memorials can be found in other Toronto churches. They often juxtapose the crucified Christ or the risen Christ with a soldier and effectively becoming a sermon in glass, such as this one that you can still find at the Church of the Redeemer down at Avenue Road in Bloor, or this one at St. Anne's in Gladstone Street, where you have the risen Christ with the soldier down below. This becomes typical of the way in which the dead are memorialized after the First World War. Even the cenotaphs that are erected both on church and city property after the First War, the ones on the left-hand side here, they explicitly link the sacrifice of Calvary to the dead soldiers. This connection between the city's Christian heritage and war, however, will largely disappear in the planning of Second World War memorials 30 years later. These World War II initiatives will generally take the form of what came to be called living memorials. They have no religious significance to them, and they really are living memorials enshrined in things like arenas, parks, and pools. As it was throughout much of the Western world, the 1920s in Toronto was a period of wild abandonment and a pursuit of pleasure, combined with even more rapid industrialization, which we talked about last week, often at the expense of religious observance. Protestant ministers of all persuasions generally complained that religion's sway over the lives of Canadians was declining rapidly in Toronto, with the churches unable to play the traditional role that they had always played as the spiritual and moral leaders of the city in a post-war society that we have to recognize was becoming increasingly less British. The Methodist Church undertook a general survey of their population after the First World War, only to discover that, quote, people were wondering whether God should be trusted in the future or revered and obeyed as a righteous and loving governor of mankind, since such a terrible cataclysm of destruction had been allowed to happen under his watch. Even those ministers who were responsible for churches that still had thriving congregations in Toronto felt that their people weren't particularly spiritual or religious. Attendance at church, they reported, seemed to be just one more community event in their lives rather than a truly religious experience. So how do you remedy the situation? Well, one way that this happened comes out of the liberal Protestant tradition, and that's namely when the Methodist churches, half of the Presbyterians, and the independent Congregationalist communities decided to come together as the United Church of Canada, which formally happened in Toronto in 1925, as you can see here at the initial inaugural service. Overnight, the United Church of Canada became the largest Protestant denomination in the country, but it had a rather broad tent that attempted to accommodate, on the one hand, very strict Calvinists who believed in salvation by faith alone, and social gospelers who maintained that good works were key to achieving the kingdom of heaven. As one scholar has put it, this union was not the product of a religious revival. Instead, it was carried out in an atmosphere of weakness and decline, and it was regarded as a hope for a new beginning. Other Protestant denominations in Toronto have, however, including both evangelical and high church Anglicans, had become wary of liberal Protestantism, especially in the light of the darkness of the First World War, and they chose a different path. These Anglicans worked to reclaim a deeper theological understanding of God and the work of the risen Christ and the worship that was owed them. Historically, both groups argued the church had always grown by preaching and practicing the gospel and not as much by social activism. And it was a time, they maintained, for Protestant churches to return to that simple faith if they wished to survive. Even some United Churchmen were with them in that same sentiment. When the new United Church Seminary, Emmanuel College, was founded in 1928, one of its first professors, the Reverend Alfred Grandier, a former social gospeler, told his students that they should reject the idea that the church should seek relevance or make accommodation with the transitory interests of a secular society. He went on, let the minister and the church aim to be strong in their own special field of worship and Christian fellowship, a realm where other things cannot compete and for which the deepest elements in human nature cry out. It was certainly countercultural advice in a city that was rapidly replacing religiosity with pleasure-seeking, materialism, and a consumer ethos. The ministers and priests of all churches could not help but notice that with the First World War receding into the rearview mirror, the introduction of everything from the motor car to the vacuum cleaner had transformed a culture of need into a culture of want. And that, in their opinion, was to the detriment of church participation and missionary activities. Also of concern, however, was the arrival of refugees and other immigrants to Toronto, fleeing the economic and social challenges in post-war Europe, especially coming from those countries that had suffered so much during the hostilities. Protestant ministers working in the inner city in particular began to see the character of their neighborhoods rapidly, very rapidly changing. Both Protestants and Catholics, whose levels of prosperity had been rising since the beginning of the 20th century, they started to decamp into the so-called suburbs. And let's not forget that in the post-World War I period, that meant our neighborhood around St. Martin's. This put greater pressure on the Protestant churches, really, than on the Catholic, because the Protestant churches still were largely national in character. That is, in general, Anglicans tended to come from England, Presbyterians tended to come from Scotland, that kind of thing. That immigration still continued, but in tandem now with the arrival of Russians, Jews, Italians, Ukrainians, Hungarians, Poles, as well as Chinese and other Asians. These new post-war immigrants, especially from the eastern parts of Europe, tended to come from either Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox territories. Now, a certain resentment crept in among some Protestants at the time, but not among all. Many embraced these new arrivals in a more ecumenical spirit. And just to give you one example, after the Russian Revolution, Russian Orthodox and Russian Jews began arriving in downtown Toronto in the 1920s. Perhaps because their church government was so similar to the Anglican Church, some local Anglicans took an interest in helping the Russian Orthodox establish a parish in the downtown core. And they even held concerts in Anglican churches to help provide them financial support. A first Russian Orthodox church was opened in 1917, the year of the Russian Revolution, on DuPont. Another opened on Spadina in 1929, but it was burned to the ground, the work of an arsonist, in the following year. After that, Orthodox services were then held in the parish hall of St. Stephen's in the Fields Anglican Church, which now found itself at the very center of a solidly Eastern European refugee community in the Kensington Market area. Once funds had been raised again, and with the help of fellow Christians, the Russian Orthodox were able to purchase an old Lutheran church on Glen Morris near the corner of Spadina and Harbord. And this new church bore the title Christ the Church, Christ the Savior. One of its parishioners was the woman you see on the right-hand side, the Grand Duchess Olga, the sister of the last Tsar, Nicholas II. And she herself was an accomplished artist who painted several icons for the interior of their new church. Now, as it turns out, the Grand Duchess also happened to be a friend of Healy Willin's wife. And she gave her this icon, which she had painted, which my understanding is, and Father Harold can correct me if I'm wrong, was eventually donated to St. Mary Magdalene's after the great composer's death. I guess my point is that in these interwar years in Toronto, this was a time when the ecumenical movement, which we may think of as a recent development, was actually getting started. There's even a minute in St. Martin's vestry report for 1922, thanking the people of Victoria Presbyterian Church up on Annette Street for sharing their space with the parish when it was still under construction that previous year. The ecumenical experience of St. Martin's was not unique in Toronto at the time, as other denominations were helping other churches get established in their new neighborhoods. In many ways, it was a reflection of what was happening on the international stage with what were called the Malines Conversations, a series of 5 informal ecumenical congresses that were held between 1921 and 1927 in Belgium to explore the possibilities for the corporate reunion between the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England. And those discussions, which were tacitly approved by the Vatican as well as by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, formed the very first stages of the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue that still continues to this day. These ecumenical gestures, I think, emerged from a sense after the First World War that if Christian churches didn't start pulling together, then society was simply going to move on with the faith punted to the sidelines. Certainly that was very much a concern here in Toronto, especially as the 1920s moved into the dirty 30s. One of the reasons that cooperation among the churches in Toronto was critical to the well-being of our society was because it was the churches that still were the primary sources for relief and welfare in Toronto as the Depression began to take firm hold, not the government. As we saw last week, by the beginning of the First World War, most churches in the city of Toronto had by then developed an infrastructure to help those most in financial need within their respective communities. Whether Catholic or Protestant, they understood that in order to be effective in combating the challenges being faced by ordinary people, they had to put denominational squabbling aside and focus on supplying the needs of a suffering population. Both the Protestant social gospel and Catholic papal teaching on social justice pointed to the inequities inherent in a strictly capitalist system that governed Canadian economic theory at the time. Yeah, the government lent some assistance, but the fact was the churches were still doing the lion's share of the hard work of meeting the dire needs of the city when politicians still weren't. The students of Wycliffe College, for example, maintained and operated an all-night urban mission at 260 Parliament Street throughout the entire period of the Depression. Not only did the United Church turn their Toronto rectories into clearinghouses for the distribution of clothing and other essentials, they also, at that time, entered into the world of social justice politics for the very first time in their history, something which I think we all know is still a hallmark of that denomination to this day. In 1933, the Reverend John Line of the United Church's Board on Evangelism and Social Service, he made the following startling statement before a meeting of the Toronto Conference. It's our belief, he stated, that the application of the principles of Jesus to economic conditions would mean the end of the capitalist system. The logical consequences of that application, he maintained, would require the socialization of the banks, socialization of natural resources, transportation, as well as other services and industries. These socialist proposals were then put to the delegates of the United Church's Toronto Conference, and they were passed by a margin of 121 for to 97 against. So the struggle to understand the role of Christianity in this epic economic crisis called the Depression was now on, but not all Toronto Christians were on the same page. For example, Charles Van Pilcher, who is professor at Wycliffe and eventually became the coadjutor bishop of Sydney, Australia, he wrote the following in a 1932 issue of the Canadian Churchman. The tone of the prayer book, he said, is quietist, not challenging. It is sedative, not rousing. In the prayer for all sorts and conditions of men, we hand the burden of the needy over to God. There is no suggestion that we should ourselves do anything about it. The implication, of course, was that social concerns should be dealt with principally through prayer. Even within the United Church, there was some sympathy for that position. The Reverend Richard Roberts of Sherborne United Church and a professor at Emmanuel College, who would go on to become the church's sixth moderator, said in one of his sermons that if God were to come among us today, he would have no other word than this: return, ye children of mine, for he would see our loot of swift gold, our frenzied pleasure-seeking, our contempt of public worship, and the sheer materialism of our hopes and desires, and beneath it all, our indifference to the values of the Spirit. Although he was a committed advocate on behalf of workers, Reverend Roberts argued that the problem with the emerging social conscience in the United Church was that it could often not be prevented from advocating for specific economic programs or supporting one particular political party. It was dangerous, he maintained, to find cures for current economic problems to Christ's teachings or to encourage the church to give a blessing to a particular political scheme. Doing so, he maintained, made the church too much of this world. As preachers, he says, we do not qualify for authoritative judgments on matters of economic or political science. It was interestingly observed by some ministers in Toronto that there was a very clear divide between those Christians who had been raised in a pre-World War I church, who tended to be more serene in their faith, taking things like the war and depression in their stride, while those raised during and after World War I had only known the experience and muddle of evil. As a result, they chafed at the serenity of their elders. Both of them, however, were going to be tested by the outbreak of the Second World War in the late summer of 1939. Initially, at least, it's interesting, Toronto's clergy were a little more reserved in the expression of their support for this latest war when it broke out. That was partly because it took a while for the various denominations to see that the threat of Nazi fascism was greater than the threat of the godless communism that they had been fighting since the end of World War I. But it was more than that. Many of the older clergy had also come to realize that their unreserved patriotism during the First World War had backfired on them, especially among returning soldiers and their surviving families. And so this time they assumed a more cautious approach. All of that notwithstanding, more men and women from across Toronto's churches volunteered for service in the Second World War, certainly more than had volunteered during the earlier conflict, to which the War Memorial at St. Martin's can attest. Christian support remained consistently strong, with the secular media, such as the Globe and Mail, reporting the content of war sermons preached from Toronto pulpits, especially at the beginning of the conflict. The war is nowhere near as interesting, however, as what happened after it. It remains a complicated phenomenon, and Canadian church historians are trying to make sense of what happened after World War II. Because for about 20 years after the end of the Second War, there was a marked resurgence in Christian worship that had been unseen, if ever seen, in the previous generations. Perfunctory religious observance had seemed more the norm before the war, but now there was an enthusiasm for practicing the faith after the war, which confounded all sorts of critics and observers. I think we're still a little too close to understand what exactly happened, but historians now suggest that the combined weight of the rampant materialism of the 1920s, combined with the greed and the desperation of the dirty 30s, combined with the existential threat to society in the early 1940s, all of them combined, for a short while at least, to force Torontonians to turn to their churches, regardless of creed, in large numbers, hoping to find community, comfort, stability, and spiritual solace. In 1946, the polls indicated that 60% of Protestants and 83% of Catholics attended services on any given Sunday in Toronto. That was huge. That's quite the uptick from the end of the 19th century, when church attendance among Protestants hovered at about 45%. Between 1951 and 1961, church attendance among Anglicans in Toronto rose by 10%, and among members of the United Church by 25%. This rise in attendance translated into a spate of church building throughout the 50s, especially as returning soldiers married and moved into the suburbs of Etobicoke and York and Scarborough. Across Canada, the United Church alone built 1,500 new churches in the 1940s and 600 rectories. Unlike the churches that we saw being built in the 19th century 2 weeks ago, many of those that you're looking at here, constructed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I think we can say rather stretched the limits of imagination about what church architecture could look like. The other side of this phenomenon, however, is oddly enough, the rapid decline in Christian, specifically Protestant influence over the culture in the city. Now, in part, that was because many of the social supports that the churches had traditionally provided within the community were now starting to be assumed by the government fully. An early form of the old age pension, for example, was introduced in 1927. Unemployment insurance was introduced nationally in 1940. The family allowance, which had been fought for so long by the United Church, was first issued nationally in 1944. In 1957, the federal and provincial governments began to share the cost of provincial health insurance, leading to the abolition of charity wards in hospitals. And then universal health care arrives in 1966. That means then the churches were no longer the first port of call for those in need, as they had been for the rest of Toronto's history. The other reason for the decline was the increase in immigration from non-British countries after World War II. We have to remember that the influence of Toronto's Protestant community in particular, which had dictated the social norms and helped shape local laws in the city from the very beginning, was now waning. Nowhere was this clearer than the whittling away of the Lord's Day laws beginning in the 1940s, laws which had been vigorously enforced in Toronto, arguably more vigorously than anywhere else in the province of Ontario. Non-Christians whose day of rest was not Sunday and who were now growing in numbers in the city argued that they were being financially penalized since they would have to close 2 days a week instead of the single day that was observed by Christians. Some of you may even recall, for example, that the Eaton stores in Toronto used to draw their curtains over their display windows on Saturday evenings and would not draw them back again until Monday to prevent even window shopping from happening on Sundays. But it was really in the realm of sports where Toronto's strict Calvinism was especially apparent and resented by many, including by numerous Christians themselves. Alan Lamport, a devout Anglican who became the city's mayor in 1951, challenged the sporting laws, saying that there was absolutely nothing unchristian about a clean game of Sunday baseball, which was prohibited, we must remember. He went on to complain that he was tired of a minority leading us around by the nose. So a plebiscite in Toronto was held on whether or not to permit Sunday sports in the city on the 2nd of January, 1950. Nearly 170,000 people voted, and the result was close. 52% voted in favor of Sunday sports. And so the law was changed, and sports could be played on Sundays, but only between the hours of 1:30 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. The one exception was horse racing, which is completely forbidden on Sundays. One disgruntled United Church minister complained about that result, saying Toronto's pro-sports vote was concentrated in gangster-plagued slums, populated by communists and foreign-born people. He was roundly criticized in the press by others who asked whether he was suggesting that only white Christians had the right to vote in this city. The times were definitely changing, but not quickly enough for some. As you can see here, on Saturday, the 31st of March, 1951, there was an important playoff game played in Toronto between the Maple Leafs and the Boston Bruins before 14,056 fans at the Gardens. The game went very long with numerous fights, injuries, and penalties. Because they were tied, the game went into overtime. If Boston had won, they would have been 2 games up to none over Toronto. But at 11:45, the game was halted because of Toronto's Lord's Day law, which required all customers to be cleared out of the Gardens before midnight. As a result, the game didn't finish, it didn't count, and Toronto actually went on to win the Stanley Cup that year. To this day, it is still the only playoff game ever called because of a curfew. All of the various and sundry provisions of the Lord's Day Act, bit by bit, were whittled away, and eventually the act would be abolished on the 24th of April, 1984. The reality is that the 1950s were really the outlier in our city's church history. The 1960s, in many ways, saw us return to the norm as it had been at the beginning of the 20th century. The difference, I would say, however, is that whereas up until the 1960s, Christianity had shaped Toronto's culture, by the 1960s, the culture was starting to shape Christianity. At the end of the 1950s, church attendance among Protestants in Toronto was already starting to decline, as low as 38% in Toronto by 1960. Essentially the numbers where they were in 1900. Since then, very sadly, many a church building has disappeared or been converted into condominiums, such as the absolutely magnificent St. Mary the Virgin and St. Cyprian Church, now turned into condo lofts. Closer to us, Victoria Royce Presbyterian Church. The Christian community, however, is still very much here. You can see here it's been turned into the lofts. The Christian community, however, is still very much here among us, thanks to people like you, offering the spiritual nourishment the city's citizens of Toronto need as they need it, and that is crucial today. And although the state has essentially taken over the social welfare functions that the church once provided, one of the church's key roles now is to hold governments and private organizations accountable, assuring that the proper care of all God's children is a matter of legislation and not just a matter of individual charity. The churches also still have an active role to play by filling in the gaps when the dignity of individuals in society is overlooked or forgotten. We are the heirs of those who went before us, and I think that we can be rightly proud of the work that the Christians in the city continue to do and have done. No one denomination could have done all of this on its own. What was required was a spirit of cooperation among the baptized who helped build the city, a spirit that has emerged over the past 200 years right here in Toronto, which still is the meeting place. And that's it. I will stop sharing. So, any questions at all or comments? I mean, some of you must absolutely remember the Lord's Day laws and how they affected your baseball games or anything else that you wanted to do that was vaguely fun.
I remember hearing about some young people who were playing baseball. I think it was in Christie Pitts, and they were stopped by the police because it was Sunday.
Yep.
It was some time ago.
Toronto, from everything I've read, most other communities in Southern Ontario had moved on by the 1950s and were more flexible.
Really?
Toronto apparently was incredibly inflexible when it came to this. And what it did was it caused resentment, especially among people for whom these laws were either not important or they kind of moved on.
Right.
When you were speaking of Cam and Cody, you didn't mention the adoption of the Armenian refugees from the genocide that were taken in by St. Paul's.
I did not know that.
Oh, yes.
That's wonderful.
The Holy Trinity Armenian Church is called Holy Trinity because it was Holy Trinity Anglican that gave them a space to worship.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
What year was that in?
Well, that was right after the First War.
Right after the First War.
Yeah. And that was the Trinity Holy Trinity Chapel upstairs was where the Armenian liturgy was celebrated.
Wonderful.
First time I heard the liturgy was in 1951.
Is that right, eh?
Yeah. And of course, the other thing is that having raised the Armenian thing, is that St. Paul's Bloor Street has a carpet that was made by Armenian orphans after the First World War and given to the church, I assume, because of all its money that it raised to help the Armenian orphans and refugees.
I'm sure there are tons of stories that can be told of the immigration and kindnesses that were done after the First World War. You could probably just do an entire thing on that. I just from what I read, I mean, it's clear we tend to think of the refugee issues more after the Second World War, but clearly after the First War, it was huge. And the church, without government support, you can imagine it was falling again on the churches.
Well, thank you. That's a great survey of all that history.
Well, as I say, it is just a survey. There's so much more. It's well worth people reading more about it. It's a fascinating period in our history. I wish there was more about Toronto church history because it's an interesting story. It really is.
Have you thought of putting your research into a book?
Absolutely not.
So good. It's so good and it's there. And
I did that before for some stuff when I worked at the library, and
yes.
it's a lot of work to turn
Yes.
something like it's between the editing and everything else that goes into it. So I think we'll leave it at this.
I just remember when I first came to Canada, I could not find any material on its history, local history, for example. I mean, you knew the main political history and etc., but there was no information, as on Toronto or other cities that you could really think about or get into understanding.
I think William Kilbourne did a wonderful history of Toronto illustrated some years ago.
There have been some great histories over the way, but my big shout out is to your local public libraries that all have in them archival files that talk about your neighborhoods. And they don't get used anywhere near enough because we don't think of public libraries as academic libraries. We think of them for pleasure. And yet they are the central locations for the preservation, besides the Archives of Toronto and the Archives of Ontario, of course. But for local histories, your local public history, your local public libraries, you couldn't ask for better resources. And the librarians that work there want you to use them, are so helpful.
On that point, I'm reminded of the Women's Institute local histories, which I'm pretty sure you can get at most local studies libraries.
I went to a public school that was called Memorial School in Hamilton, and it had a couple of cannons and a few other things, and all around the main hall were paintings of the great battle sites in the First World War. So we were very conscious of the war, and you certainly didn't misbehave on Remembrance Day and things like that. But we only had British history. We didn't get any local history. So that's a great loss.
For a long time, people thought Canadian history was boring, and
Yeah.
I don't think Canadian history is all boring. I think perhaps the way it has been taught has been boring,
Yes.
but Canadian history is not boring. It's
No, it isn't.
fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, what you've presented hasn't been boring, so
Yeah. Oh.
we could need to put it somewhere sometime. Hmm.
A
I think
family
Pierre
story. Sorry.
Sorry.
I think Pierre Burton did a lot to dispel the belief that Canadian history was boring.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just a family story. My grandfather, Canon Barnett, was the rector of St. Clement's Riverdale in the 20s and 30s, and he had been a chaplain in the First World War, and he, facing the Depression, because that part of the city was very, very poor at the time, he called on the rich colonels that he got to know in the course of the army and twisted their arms into supplying food and clothing for the people in his parish,
Yeah,
including his own 7 children.
Yeah. I'm sure there are all sorts of stories like that. And if you go back and revisit by Grace co-workers, the history of the Diocese of Toronto, you'll find some of those stories, but there are so many more like that that are not recorded and deserve to be better known. What the churches did in the absence of real government support is beyond commendable. The society wouldn't have survived had it not been for what all of the churches did and took seriously.
Thanks again.
Yes, Father, on behalf of all of us and the whole parish and all those who will watch these recordings in the future, weeks and months to come, thank you so much. I know how much work has gone into this, and it's been a real gift to all of us. So thank you for your scholarship and your humor and your winsome way of presenting our history to us. We've learned a lot. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
You
Thank you.
Thank
It
you.
was fun.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording.